Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Ben Francis, and tonight we're joined by regular guest and Scottish independent activist and writer William Duguid. Hi, William. How's it going?
Oh, it's going fine, Ben, and good to be back with you here.
All right, we have an interesting show, but first we'll start with the Ukraine update on day 840 of the war. The United States has lifted a ban on providing weapons and training to Ukraine's Azov Brigade, which had far right roots but proved key to the defense of the major city of Mariupol. Azov was absorbed into Ukraine's National Guard as the 12th Special Forces Brigade, and current members reject accusations of extremism and ties with far right movements. US law prohibits providing equipment and training to foreign military units or individuals suspected of committing gross human rights violations. The State Department said on Tuesday that it found, quote, no evidence of such violations by Azov. The Azov Brigade held out in a siege and low on ammunition for weeks at Mariupol's steel mill, despite devastating attacks from Russian forces in 2022 at the beginning of the Ukraine war. They are hailed as heroes in Ukraine, and people take to the streets for weekly rallies calling for the release of hundreds of Azov prisoners of war who remain in Russian captivity. The United States will send Ukraine another Patriot missile system, US officials said on Tuesday, in a move approved by President Biden. It would be the second Patriot system that the United States has given directly to Ukraine, along with an undisclosed number of missiles it uses. Other allies, including Germany, also have provided air defense systems as well as ammunition for them. Speaking in Madrid recently, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukraine needed another 7 Patriot systems to effectively defend against Russian strikes. Violence against children in war reached, quote, extreme levels in 2023, including in the Ukraine war, according to the UN's annual report, Children in Armed Conflict. The United Nations kept the Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups on its blacklist for a second year over their killing and maiming of children and attacking schools and hospitals in Ukraine. The White House has said steps to use frozen Russian assets for Ukraine's benefit will be announced at this week's G7 summit in Italy, as well as new sanctions and export controls. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby predicted, quote, unanimity among G7 members who hope to agree a deal on using the profits from the interest on €300 billion of frozen Russian central bank assets as collateral for a loan to Ukraine. Ahead of the Swiss summit this weekend on peace in Ukraine, Zelensky's office has said it wants Russia to attend a subsequent summit to receive an internationally agreed roadmap towards ending the war. Moscow has said it has no interest in joining this weekend's meeting, and so was not invited by the hosts, Switzerland. More than 90 countries have confirmed their attendance at this weekend summit, and Ukraine hopes abstainers like China would join the process sooner rather than later. The office of Argentina's president, Javier Milei, has confirmed he will participate in the Swiss summit. Milei has a good relationship with Zelensky and has sought to strengthen ties with Western countries. 2 Indian nationals drafted by the Russian army were killed in the war against Ukraine, the Indian Foreign Ministry said on Tuesday, as it pressed for prompt reparations of the remains and the release of other Indians who were duped into fighting for the Russian army. The Ukrainian president and his allies used a major conference in Berlin on Tuesday to lobby international business for support in Ukraine's reconstruction and recovery, even as it continues to be bombarded by Russia. Zelensky addresses the Bundestag, Germany's parliament, in person for the first time. The event was boycotted by the right-wing populist Alternative for Deutschland party, an opponent of supporting Ukraine's war effort and arming Ukraine. So, William, what do you think of the latest update, and what do you think of the decision of the United States to effectively reverse their ban on selling the Azov Brigade weapons?
Well, they're putting a fair bit of faith in the Azov Brigade having moved away from its far right roots. I know that many now in the Azov Brigade, since it was absorbed into the National Guard, tend to refute the ties to the far right. But it is, I think, a worry. But it's obviously very important that the US is able to square this because, as you said, there is a law against providing equipment to foreign military units suspected of human rights violations. So they have to have conducted their investigation, and they have to be able to say there are no evidence of violations, which they've said. Whether that stands up over time is another matter, but certainly it's part of the increasing US aid for Ukraine, also marked by the delivery of another Patriot missile system, and Zelensky in his shuttle diplomacy rounds still wants more. We continue to get to the point where maybe Ukraine's got the ammunition and it's got the delivery systems to be able to defend itself properly. And it'll be interesting to see if that does bring about any change in the course of the war. Meanwhile, I'm glad to see there is at least some form of talking about peace, because we do need a way out of this. Even if Russia isn't going to be there, and even if China isn't going to be there, even if we might get China along later, um, we need to be having these conversations because we need to be sorting these areas of the world out. Things are very unstable at the moment, and we can't really risk any sort of escalation. We need to work out what the path forward is.
Yeah, for sure. Totally agree. And looking at the time, we'll move on to the Israel-Gaza latest update. The Gaza Health Ministry has said that at least 37,202 Palestinians have been killed and 84,932 injured in Israeli attacks on Gaza since the 7th of October. A United Nations investigation has accused Israel and Hamas of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity on and since the 7th of October, the date of Hamas's surprise attack on Israel. A commission of inquiry formed in 2021 by the UN Human Rights Council accuses Hamas's military wing and 6 other Palestinian armed groups allied in some instances by Palestinian civilians of killing, torture, sexual violence, and systemic kidnapping. The commission found Israeli authorities, quote, responsible for the war crimes of starvation as a method of warfare, murder or willful killing, intentionally directing attacks against civilians and civilian objects, forcible transfer, sexual violence, torture, and inhuman or cruel treatment, arbitrary detention, and outrage upon personal dignity, end quote. Israel's military has issued a statement saying that it continues to operate in the central Gaza Strip in the Rafah area. Airstrikes have also been reported in Gaza City to the north of the territory. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on Wednesday Hamas had proposed, quote, numerous changes, end quote, in its response to a ceasefire proposal, some of which are workable, some of which are not. Speaking in Doha, he said, quote, Hamas could have answered with a single word, yes. Instead, Hamas waited nearly 2 weeks and requested numerous changes. The time for a decision is now. The longer this goes on, the more people will suffer, end quote. Qatar's Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani said both Hamas and Israel have been counterproductive on different occasions. An Israeli airstrike on the village of Joina in southern Lebanon late on Tuesday night killed 3 Hezbollah operatives, as well as Talib Abdullah, the most senior commander to be killed since hostilities began 8 months ago. His funeral was held in Beirut on Wednesday. The chief of Hezbollah's executive council, Hashem Safidi, has vowed to increase the intensity of attacks on Israel. Hezbollah has launched its biggest salvo of rockets at Israel since the beginning of the war in Gaza, in apparent retaliation for the killing of the senior field commander. Hezbollah fired a barrage of about 50 rockets into the Israel-occupied Golan Heights, followed by another 90 fired at northern Israel. Some were intercepted by Israel's air defense systems, but some were intercepted, by Israel's air defense systems, but summer heatwave temperatures meant that the projectiles caused fires in a number of areas. Israel said it carried out strikes on the sources of the launch in southern Lebanon. So, William, what do you make of the story, and how likely do you think a ceasefire is at this point with the American efforts?
I think it's probably not imminent, although you never know. When we had a ceasefire, I think it was November, December, it was after a number of weeks of the war. That came quite quickly and actually proved to be the best way to release hostages, both the hostages that Hamas hold and also the prisoners, which are effectively hostages that the Israeli authorities have taken from Gaza as well as from the West Bank and other
Yeah.
places. Um, I would always say, and I think probably many of the relatives of hostages would echo that um, the sort of military campaign that's been conducted against Gaza is by no means the optimal way of freeing hostages. Negotiation is always a better way. And one possible fear is that the success this week in releasing 4 hostages may encourage Israel not to be too quick about agreeing to any ceasefire. I have to say that Antony Blinken's words about the ceasefire negotiations and the proposal are just a little bit skewed, because the kind of points I think on which Hamas is stalling is probably around the Egyptian observers are saying anyway that it's about a permanent ceasefire that allows Hamas to continue in Gaza. Now, maybe that second bit is too much for Israel, but the permanent ceasefire you would hope would not be. So it's not necessarily minor issues that Hamas are trying to make changes over. And I think probably the case is that, as in all difficult negotiations, there is a little bit of obstructiveness on both sides, and the Qatar brokers of the ceasefire deal seem to echo that. So it remains a very regrettable situation with the carnage continuing, and I think no immediate prospect that this will stop, which is really the saddest thing of all.
So, moving on to our coverage of the general election campaign, and starting with the Conservatives, Grant Shapps, sorry, bad pronunciation, the Conservative Defence Minister has said this morning that voters should fear a Labour quote supermajority after the election, leading many opposition politicians and commentators to argue, even Conservative MPs think they have no chance of victory in the general election. The comments follow an opinion poll released yesterday, putting the Conservative Party's vote share at 19%, about 20 points under Labour and only 1 point ahead of Reform UK to the right. So, William, how do you react to Grant Shapps' comments?
It's the normal sort of defence mechanism you would have when your election campaign is crumbling before your very ears. As you may report later, I'm not sure. It kind of echoes some of the things some of the other parties are saying. Plaid Cymru are saying it, and the SNP are saying it. That you don't need to vote all these Labour folks in order to get the Tories out. We'll do just as well in our places. I do think that the Tory campaign is in big trouble, and they're doing what they can. And one is reminded of 1997 and the New Labour New Danger, and it's always a danger of a supermajority, and what Labour will do to the country and all that sort of thing. And it's couched in those apocalyptic terms. The fact of the matter is, thus far, the Tories have run a quite appalling and incompetent campaign, and they deserve everything that appears to be coming to them. That's reflected in the polls at the moment. Things could change, but they're going to have to do a lot better than they've done so far. And Grant Shapps could maybe get on, maybe with campaigning a little more effectively rather than just scaremongering.
Do you think there is any credible way the Conservatives could actually manage to increase their polling? Do you think there's a strategy they could take?
It's difficult because not only do they have Labour to worry about, and they definitely do have to worry about Labour, but they also have Reform UK
Mm.
right on their shoulder. And bearing in mind that I don't think Reform UK, who are running 57 candidates in Scotland because they're running just about everywhere, I don't think Reform UK are necessarily going to um, do much more damage to the Tories in Scotland because they're not as popular in Scotland. That would indicate that they're even more popular in England if their overall percentage is just behind. So
Yeah.
I think it's a double bind. It's a double bind for the Conservatives. And maybe this is one of the sea changes in politics that you do get from time to time. Usually, when a party has been in power too long, and they certainly, I would say, have in this case.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we are going to get onto that at the end of the election segment, Reform UK specifically. But first, we'll move on to Labour. Delphic Energy, a large energy corporation, has confirmed it will withdraw from the Pensacola well in the North Sea, blaming ongoing market volatility and negative political rhetoric. On X, former Scottish Labour MSP Neil Findlay strongly criticised Keir Starmer following Starmer's comments that the Conservative Party's manifesto was, quote, a Corbyn-style manifesto. William, what do you make of Neil Findlay's comments about the manifesto?
Well, his comments about the comments. It was a bizarre thing that Keir Starmer said. I mean, obviously, Keir Starmer, although he bought into Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto at the time, I seem to recall. I know he has several bones to pick with Jeremy Corbyn, but sort of putting the Tories alongside Jeremy Corbyn in this particular quote is bizarre and probably quite confusing for members of the electorate, and doesn't just ring true at all. So you could say it was a passing remark. We all make our passing remarks in elections, don't? Well, we say we. People wanting elected have all sorts of interesting adventures in campaigns. One thinks of Gordon Brown and his remarks picked up in the microphone. Maybe Keir Starmer's this latest remark is a minor example of that. But yeah, Neil Findlay's quite right to criticise it. It's just doesn't make sense.
Yeah. And like, do you think if he continues to make comments like this, that has a risk of alienating like the sort of left voters within Labour who voted for Jeremy Corbyn in 2019 and 2017?
Um, I, yeah, I think there is a risk of the left within Labour being alienated, not just because of this, but because of the far more serious issues of the treatment, I think now resolved, of Diane Abbott, but also other candidates who've been taken off candidate list
Yeah.
for apparently minor offences when others might who have done things have been brought in as candidate. Luke Akehurst, for example, who is nothing more to my mind than an apologist for the state of Israel. So I think that is a problem within the Labour Party that will not affect them in this election. I think it will take a cataclysm to prevent Labour winning this election the way things currently look. But once they get into power, what sort of party will they be, and how happy a party will they be as the broad church that they used to be? I very much doubt that they'll be able to achieve that. And I think the future of the Labour Party probably is a rightward drift, and I think that will tend to disappoint the many people who will vote for them, thinking that they do mean change, because that's exactly what they will not mean if they become basically a photocopy of the Tory Party of the last 10 years or so.
So moving on to the Green Party, the UK Green Party has launched its manifesto calling for higher taxes on the wealthy, such as a wealth tax, in order to invest in the economy and public services, in order to fix what the Green Party has described as, quote, broken Britain. So William, how well do you think the Green Party will do in the election? Do you think they'll manage to like pick up a few more seats? Especially
Um, I,
Bristol,
I
thinking
think
about?
that the polls are somewhat dubious about that. Obviously, up till now, their sole representative in the UK, in fact, but certainly in England, has been Caroline Lucas, who is stepping down. She, of course, had the benefit of incumbency and indeed was a very good um, representative of party and constituency MP, as far as I can tell. I think they have high hopes, perhaps, for a couple of seats. At one time, they've thought of getting 4 seats. Um, it's very, very hard to call in the current situation because um, everything is going to be very slightly chaotic with the results, with all the various parties pitching in and then doing strange things. So I think the Greens will certainly get one. Maybe they'll get two. I don't think they'll make the major breakthrough that they would want to make and that they have made in some other countries in Europe. But I think they will be happy to do respectably and will hopefully use a lot of the issues that are going to come up over the next 5 years to further enhance their support.
Yeah, so like I guess related to that, like how well do you think the Greens campaign has been going? Because obviously, like I'm seeing like sort of specifically compared to Reform UK, because like and the fact that Keir Starmer is drifting Labour to the right. Do you think like the Greens campaign isn't as effective as it could be, given the potential they have, given Labour's rightward drift?
They struggle to get a voice. That's the big problem. They are in England an effective alternative left wing way to place your vote. So if you were alienated about the Labour Party, maybe you would go Green if you were of that sort of cast of mind. But of course, there are many other candidate parties trying to take some of that vote away from Labour as well. So I think the truth is they're probably campaigning as effectively as they can until the UK weans itself off first past the post. They really do have a problem getting the sort of exposure that they really need to make a big impact.
Do you think in any way like the Green Party could have a comparative campaign as like Reform UK, for example, on the left? Like, do you think that's possible, or do you think it's like no matter what the Green Party does, it's just because of like the dynamic of the election, it's not going to happen?
Well, the big difference for Reform UK is that one, they're a limited company, and two, they're very well funded, which is why, unlike the Greens, they're able to stand a candidate in every single seat. And also, the Greens do not have that TV camera magnet that appears to be Nigel Farage. And this is just one of the unfairnesses of British politics, I think. But until they have a big advantage like that and maybe a major personality, Caroline Lucas was some personality, but nothing like the level of Nigel Farage, and not necessarily in Nigel Farage's case is a good way. Until they have that, I think they will continue to struggle in the first past the post.
So to finish off the election section, I'll just move on to the Scottish National Party. The SNP and Labour have drawn even in Scotland in Westminster voting, according to a new poll. A survey by Ipsos for STV spoke to 1,150 people across the country between the 3rd and 9th of June and found both parties level on 36%. The Scottish National Party leader in Westminster, Stephen Flynn, has also sent an open letter to the Scottish Labour leader Anna Sarwar, arguing that claims Sarwar made that a Labour government would not enact any cuts to public services were false and dishonest. So, William, are the polls starting to narrow as the election campaign continues, do you think, for SNP and Labour?
It would appear that they are, because this is not the only poll today by Ipsos that has shown this narrowing. The Ipsos poll, 1,150 is a decent sample. The fieldwork's been carried out from the 3rd to the 9th of June, so it's reasonably up to date. It includes, interestingly, the TV debate, the time of the TV debate in which Stephen Flynn took part, where he was, I think, highly effective, and to many ears he won the debate, and certainly he got a lot of kudos in England for the way he approached the whole thing. I think we're beginning to see a narrowing, but there is a long way to go. 3 weeks to go. It's not a done deal by any means. I think at the moment, having started from where they were, the SNP would probably bite your hand off if you offered them the same percentage as Labour, which would result, I think, in 27 seats each in Scotland if it were across the board. Of course, it will be a lot more complicated than across the board because of individual seats and the way they work. Three would go to the Lib Dems and the Tories would have none at all, which would be quite remarkable. And again, reminiscent of 1997. So all to play for. And I think the Swinny bounce is real. but it has to be sustained. And the big advantage the SNP has got is, even in a time when their membership is not as great as it has been, they have a very dedicated set of volunteers and activists that will chap the doors for them and deliver leaflets. And I know a lot of them locally from the hub where I work. And that's going to make it quite interesting in a lot of seats, I think.
So moving on to our next story, abortion safe zone bills passes. Scottish Greens MSP Gillian Mackay has praised the campaigners and medical professionals for their determination after her bill to bring in buffer zones around healthcare facilities offering abortions was passed into law by the Scottish Parliament today. The Abortion Service Safe Access Zones Scotland Bill was agreed by 118 votes to 1 at its final stage of consideration in the Scottish Parliament today, sparking scenes of jubilation among supporters. It brings an end to protesters being able to intimidate women seeking abortions or healthcare experts by establishing 200-meter wide exclusion zones where disgraceful scenes will be prohibited by law. Addressing fellow MSPs and elected Miss Mackay said simply thank you, as the presiding officer Alison Johnston confirmed the count. The legislation will now move forward to receive royal assent. Ms. Mackay said, quote, "This is for women and medical professionals who have endured protests amid disgraceful scenes in the past while accessing healthcare, and for all those who may need to go do the same in the future." Quote, It also carved into history the work and support of others, including with that. Okay. So, William, do you think this law is bad for free speech, or do you think it's more of an issue of like harassment?
Free speech is always a balance. And another fundamental principle that I think we more or less accept in society now is that a woman has an absolute right to decide what happens with her own body. Now,
Yeah,
you may disagree with the legislation, but you cannot stand and harass medical professionals and indeed women who are about to undergo what is always a difficult event for them. And abortion is not just a thing you decide on a whim. So these procedures have to be carried out with dignity, with privacy, and with regard to the emotions involved. And harassment is not really on. And so I'm
yeah.
perfectly behind this policy. 200 yards prevents anything of that sort. And I'm also glad to see that it's a cross-party piece of legislation that's come through, and there hasn't been any serious opposition to it, because I think that means we're acting a little bit as a grown-up country, and now a country moving into line with the rest of the UK, because this is somewhere we have been behind in.
Yeah. Why do you think it's been why do you think a difference in laws existed between Scotland and the UK so far? It's a legacy thing.
Well, devolution means things are done at different rates. We're ahead of England in some things, maybe behind in other things. So it's taken a little while. I mean, the draft legislation came up 2 years ago for various reasons, and I don't know exactly what they would be. It's taken this long to get to this stage. It was not until October 2023 that this bill was introduced, and it's finally got through. And I think we should be grateful for that.
Yeah, no, for sure. So moving on to our next story, UK GDP flatlined in April. The United Kingdom economy flatlined in April, held back by wet weather as the signs of a recovery from last year's recession begin to fade, in a blow to Rishi Sunak's hopes of signalling a strong bounce back before the general election on the 4th of July. The Office for National Statistics (ONS) said monthly growth slowed after a 0.4% increase in March. The economy was unable to maintain its momentum after being weighed down by the struggling retail sector, a downturn in manufacturing, and a drop in construction output. The 0% growth figure matched the forecast by city economists, who blamed the month of heavy rains for difficulties faced by workers on building sites and the lack of shoppers on the high streets. Manufacturing output fell by 1.4% month on month in April, while construction activity was 1.4% lower and retailers lost 2% of their trade. These declines were balanced out by a 2% rise across the whole service sector, boosted by rises in IT and communication services, professional business 1.2%, and arts and entertainment 2.6%. The General Secretary of the Trade Union Congress, Paul Nowak, said the economy's stagnation was causing long-term harm to household incomes. S&P economy spokesperson Drew Hendry said, quote, "The UK's stagnant economy shows the damage done by 14 years of austerity cuts and Brexit, reckless policies that the Labour Party will continue to impose on Scotland." Quote, "The S&P strongly opposes Sir Keir Starmer's plan for £18 billion of cuts, which will mean less money for our NHS, less money for schools, and less money to invest in economic growth." Quote, "And only the S&P is offering Scotland an escape from Brexit, which has wiped billions off our economy, hammered businesses, and sent the cost of living soaring." So, William, more generally, like, what do you think the solution is for like the economic stagnation that we've been experiencing over the last couple of years, like in this country and across like Europe to an extent as well?
Yeah, I think the UK, it's not the only one affected. You're quite right, but it is
Yeah.
quite badly affected, and Brexit perhaps makes the difference. What we need is a culture where the economy is properly invested in, um, and we need to take inflation out of the game, and it seems to be coming down, but it's been quite stubborn about that. And also, I think interest rates need to come down again because I think they are acting as a drag anchor on the whole economy, and they remain higher in the UK than in many places. So basically, the three areas that need to be fixed are skills shortage. We need to sort that out. However, we do it by training people, by looking at immigration and who we bring in of working age who can do jobs, and the high prices, that's for sure, and the elevated interest rates. And it could well be that the Bank of England sees the current growth figures as a reason for keeping interest rates high. That would be entirely counterproductive. Um, Britain has always had a productivity problem of one sort or another. It was particularly bad in the 60s and 70s, and it's come back again. And it's all down to investing in the economy properly. And that's what we need to do. Austerity has been a disaster. And if different policies had been followed after the crash in 2008, then we might not be in quite such a bad position. And it doesn't sound as if Labour are looking to create any solutions to that because government spending, when ordinary people aren't spending, governments need to spend in order to run an economy at all. So I don't think the outlook's going to be getting any better anytime soon.
And do you think like if Scotland was an independent country, we'd be able to like address these problems you're talking about more effectively?
I would hope that a Scottish government under independence would take a different approach to it. It would be absolutely vital that in the first years of an independent Scotland, we invested in our economy. And that would mean a certain amount of borrowing. It might mean a certain amount of creating currency because we would, I would hope, have our own currency at that point. But we have to get the economy moving in order to use the advantages we've got in terms of resources. Um, it's not a done deal. Scotland could become independent and make a mess of it, but it's the thing that gives us a chance of having the right policies to get the economy up and running and properly productive. And I would hope we would take it.
So moving on to our next story, failure, which is quite linked to what we're just talking about, failure to invest in the United Kingdom regional cities holding back economic growth. A failure to invest in the United Kingdom's main regional cities has held back economic growth and meant living standards standards of living lag behind the United States, France, and Germany, according to a report before the 50th G7 summit in southern Italy this week. The Centre of Cities think tank said the major difference between the United Kingdom and its main rivals was the low level of productivity in cities such as Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, Sheffield, and Nottingham. It said the higher level of productivity, measured by the output of each worker per hour, could be seen in cities outside Paris and Berlin of a similar size to the UK counterparts. The study found that the investment was also spread more evenly across a wide range of US cities, which have performed well after benefiting from local financial support, and more recently, the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act and CHIPS Act, which offered more than £800 billion worth of subsidies over 10 years. Centre for Cities urged the next UK government to focus on a broader investment programme to help consolidate digital industries in regional cities. Andrew Carter, the think tank chief executive, said, quote, "The message for policymakers is to take note of why the US, France, and Germany performed so much better than the United Kingdom, while not the exclusive reason, a major part of the success of their big cities." In 2022, a measure of G7 productivity as a proportion of annual national income ranked the United Kingdom as fourth, behind the US, Germany, and France. UK productivity was about 16% below the US and Germany. So, William, why do you think that there's been so little investment in the UK compared to other European countries, historically?
Well, to be fair, absolutely fair to the UK first and foremost, within the G7, which is what we're talking about, the UK is bang in the middle. So it's behind US, France, and Germany, and it's ahead of Canada, Italy, and Japan. So I think it's the centralisation in London that is the big problem. London is like something that sucks all the economic power away from the rest of the country, and there has never been a UK government that's really been able to adjust to that by properly investing in the whole of the UK, all its regions and all its countries. And whether you do that through the Barnett formula or any other way, it needs to be done. And if you take as an example of that, the withdrawal of the HS2 project that was supposedly going to revivify the north of England, and it's never been adequately replaced. You need to be investing in skills, as I said, of the local populations. You need to be spending on transport locally so that those cities can really hum and there's a buzz about them and things are working well. It's easy to see in our cities outside London that there are so many areas where there's just no prosperity. Glasgow is mentioned, but just looking around the centre of Perth, a far smaller city, that could do with so much investment coming in. And instead, if you go down to London and you see just the change from year to year, even in the amount of construction and all the sort of glittering buildings. You can take a boat trip down the river and you'll just be astonished. You'll be seeing nothing like you get in those other places in the UK, including in Scotland. So it's the centralisation of London. That is the biggest issue I think we have. London in the southeast is sucking all the money away, and we need to redistribute it better.
Yeah. And how do you think, when governments invest in infrastructure projects like high speed rail, for example, how do you think they can do it in a way which doesn't cost such ridiculous amounts of money, like HS2 ended up costing, or the trams in Edinburgh? Do you think there's a way governments can more effectively, source some
Yeah.
money for these projects?
The answer is I don't know, because it's a perennial problem. It doesn't happen with all infrastructure projects. One thinks of the Queen's Ferry crossing that the Scottish Government managed to deliver under budget, but there are many other examples, both in Scotland and indeed in the UK, of ridiculous overspending. And it's ultimately down to a bad set of practices, both in terms of deciding what you're going to do and seeking views from consultation on how you do it, and uh, just carelessness about how you actually spend the money, spending the money ineffectively rather than effectively, and then the
Yeah.
cost goes up and up and up. That's one of the biggest things. But there are probably books written on the failure of public procurement to give you proper results. There are numerous reasons, but the fundamental reason is I just think that we're not electing governments who are up to the task most of the time.
So looking at the time, we'll move on to our next story. Emmanuel Macron urged French parties to unite against the far right. French President Emmanuel Macron has urged all parties to form an alliance against Marine Le Pen's far right national rally and resist the quote spirit of defeatism end quote after he announced a surprise snap election in response to the far right's large gains in the European elections. With the right wing at a historic high and the French political class plunged into uncertainty with less than 3 weeks until the first round of the legislative vote, Macron said he had dissolved parliament and called the election in order to hold back quote extremes. He said he did not want to give the keys to power to the far right in the presidential election of 2027 and had therefore triggered a movement to provide clarification. He said he trusted the French people to decide whether they wanted the far right in government. He believed the nation did not want them in power and would vote to keep it out. Macron said he had taken into account the anger expressed in the European election vote in France, in which the National Rally Party, Marine Le Pen's party, took more than 31% of the vote, which was more than double the result of Macron's centrist grouping. The total vote for right-wing to far-right parties reached almost 40%. Macron said the policies of the RN would impoverish workers and pensioners and be bad for the economy. He said, quote, "You've expressed anger, message received, but is an expression of anger the answer to your daily life? I say no," end quote. He described Le Pen's party as, quote, "a political project that won't be able to respond to the insecurity you're feeling. What's the concrete answer? They don't have one," end quote. Macron, whose centrist grouping failed to win an absolute majority in parliament in the legislative elections that followed his re-election in 2022, said he hoped for, quote, clarity from the electorate, which could lead to a broader governing coalition by his centrists. So, William, do you think, or like broadly, like why do you think Macron is calling the election? Do you think he's hoping that he'll benefit out of it by polarizing it as him against the far right?
I think he's actually hoping that the high vote for far right parties, particularly National Rally, was a protest vote. Um, in a way, he's, I think, protecting himself in 2027 by trying now, before things get too bad, to get into Parliament a sort of coalition that is more comfortable with. It is a gamble for him. I mean, if he fails effectively, I mean, I don't know exactly how the constitutional side of things works in France, but he could find himself a lame duck president if he's not very careful. Not just the extreme right at 40%, but there's the left wing parties too.
Yeah, yeah.
And you're getting towards 50%. But I think he is making a political judgment that now is the time to lance the boil. And the question is whether the French people believe the same thing and will vote according to the way he suggests. And that is far from clear.
So, like, how well do you think he will do in the election? And also, like, why do you think he's so unpopular in polling?
I think he's unpopular for the reasons that many of our leaders everywhere are unpopular, because people are struggling. People aren't just struggling in the UK. They may be struggling a lot more in some cases in the UK, but in France, people have been having difficulty getting by, even when they're working. People don't feel they're listened to when they raise those concerns, and that is an alienating factor, and any government will face that. And I think Macron is acknowledging these things without suggesting he's actually able to do very much about it, and he's just trying to get into Parliament a coalition that he can be comfortable with, to give himself time, not to make an absolute mess of the 2027 election in which the president is elected. And as I say, it's a wee bit of a gamble, but there you go. Politicians sometimes gamble.
Do you think politicians like Macron are sort of like part of the problem when it comes to explaining why the far right is rising in the first place? Due to his, governing from the center right, his austerity, trying to cut the age of pensions, for example. Do you think that kind of atmosphere he's creating is emboldening the far right in France?
Very possibly, because when people then demagogues and extremists, if you like, people on the extremes of politics, they have fertile ground to be working with. And certainly Macron has done a lot to make the situation worse. I think the pensions thing was probably a disaster.
Yeah.
Even though the age of 62, bite your hand off again for that, for the state pension. So yeah, but it's a complex thing. I mean, there's a general move towards the far right in parts of Europe, most notably Germany, also in the EU elections. So it's not just Macron, but certainly he's not helping himself.
So we'll move on to our next story. The University of Glasgow ranks 12th in the world in THE impact rankings. The University of Glasgow has ranked 12th in the world in the 2024 Times Higher Education Impact Rankings today. The result is an improvement of the one place on the 2023 results and means the University of Glasgow places top in Scotland and third overall among UK universities. First Minister John Swinney said, quote, Scotland has a world-class higher education sector with universities the length and breadth of the country, making an extraordinary local, national and international impact. I am delighted that the University of Glasgow's social impact has been recognised as truly world-leading, and I congratulate all of the students and staff on this extraordinary success. Quote, our universities will be crucial partners for government as we seek to grow the economy, improve public services, tackle the climate emergency, and eradicate child poverty. And I look forward to working with the University of Glasgow and our university sector as a whole on these shared goals, end quote. Glasgow Strathclyde University came in a joint 25th in the World Ranking 2024 Impact. The rankings are the first and only global performance tables that assess universities against the SDGs and focus on dual issues of protecting the environment and addressing inequality through sustainable development, and have been expanded to include 1,963 institutions from around the world. So, William, do you think it's significant, this ranking, or do you think that the score risks distracting people from, maybe things that Glasgow University has been doing which aren't so savoury, like giving money to weapons manufacturers involved in Gaza, or cutting the wages of the staff while paying higher-ups a lot more money?
Ooh, that's a very loaded question there.
It is.
Yeah, well, it probably won't do much distracting because I doubt very much that it will get much publicity outside Broadcasting Scotland. John Swinney has seized in it as to praise the university sector and the way the Scottish government works with it, and he's doing that because there's a Westminster election in 3 weeks. And that's why you won't be hearing about this on the BBC. So I think working with sustainable development goals is a good thing, and it doesn't perhaps excuse anything else that's going on badly, and those things need to be. But I think you should give due credit for what's being done fairly well, and they have featured quite highly in the top 50. That is of in 9 of the 17 sustainable development goals, and that is quite a good thing. And they're not just maintaining their position, they're improving it. So distraction it may be, but it is worth giving them at least the credit for that.
Fair enough. I've got a bit of a bias having went to university for 4 years and experienced the strikes as a result of the funding cuts, so that might explain it a bit. But we'll move on to our last story of the night. Scottish Government increases pay for children's social care staff. Staff in children's social care services will see their pay increase to at least £12 an hour thanks to new Scottish Government funding, backed by over 19 million this year. It will ensure more than 6,000 people working in a direct care role in the voluntary, private and independent sector services receive the pay increase, which could be worth more than 2,000 a year for some staff. It will help people providing direct care to vulnerable children and young people under the age of 18, including personal assistance, and all payments will be backdated and provided for all hours worked from April 2024. Increasing pay for children's social care workers was a commitment set out in the 2023 programme for government. Minister for Children, Young People and the Promise, Natalie Dawn, said, quote, this uplift is an important step forward in supporting our highly valued social care staff across Scotland. The support they provide is invaluable and the government is committed to ensuring no one is paid less than the real living wage. Children's social care services couldn't be delivered without our private, voluntary, and independent sector providers, and this funding will help support the sustainability of their services. Quote, the implementation of this uplift would not have been possible without close working with our partners, especially with COLSA and with health and social care partnerships, end quote. So, William, what do you make of like pay increases?
I think it's a decent pay increase. It sounds good. It's important about that nobody is getting less than the real living wage, not the pretend living wage that used to be called the minimum wage. I think probably there's scope to do still better. I think this sort of work should be really well rewarded in order really to attract people into a very important sector. But there are obviously constraints and finances. So to have achieved this is fairly good. And it's a move forward. And let's hope that we can build an economy where we can do even more. And again, I'm going to say independence is a way when we would have the potential to do more. But good, a government made a commitment and they've kept the promise, and that right now is good enough for me.
Fair enough, yeah. Well, looking at the time, since we started 10 minutes over, I think that's all we have time for this evening. But before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. Our programme will always be free to view, however, if you can afford just £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly donation, thank you. Our focus must now move to securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscriber base and regular funding. So thank you to our guest, William. Thanks, William.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.
Goodbye, and thank you for watching.